it's time for us to do more thinking about ethnicity along the Thai-Malay Peninsula. And as you are probably aware, this is something that I have studied for a number of years, and it's nice to be able to introduce some of the insights of not only my ethnographic study of the way in which Thais, about Thai Muslims, ethnic Malays, people who call themselves not Malay but Thai Muslims because they can no longer speak Thai, people in further up the peninsula who are happy to be called Kag, as opposed to Malays who are not. So I've been thinking about ethnonyms and about the circumstantialist approach to understanding ethnicity, both in Thailand and Malaysia, for a long time. And it's nice to be able to just to sit back and to, I'm going to make myself comfortable, it's nice to just sit back and to talk you through some of these issues. And so our objectives today are to provide a brief historical sketch of the peninsula. And I think it's a good thing to refer to this peninsula as the Thai-Malay Peninsula or the Siamese-Malay Peninsula. And we're going to outline the spheres of influence and the way that these have changed and the development of nation states and different ethnicities along the peninsula. And we're going to be looking at some of the paradoxes of modern Malayness in present-day South Thailand. So that's roughly where we're going. And you'll see from the outline picture, it's not going to be particularly step 1, step 2, step 3. We may go around in circles and then come back a bit later on. And I hope that you are perfectly all right with that. So, the Thai-Malay Peninsula is linguistically, culturally and religiously extremely diverse. And here are some of just a number of relatively recently published books that explore this fascinating ethnic, linguistic, cultural and religious diversity. Some people think that there is a point in the peninsula where you go from Buddhist majority through to Muslim majority. But this is a oversimplification. This is something which ignores certain parts of the peninsula having enclaves, the importance of towns where Chinese, where Thai-speaking Muslims, where Malay Muslims, where Thais, as well as other smaller ethnic groups meet together. It ignores the importance of cultural and ethnic hybridity, the way that people refer to themselves in more than one way. It ignores the fact that linguistically most people on the peninsula are multilingual, and that it is mistaken to think that only Malays speak Malay, only Malay Muslims speak Malay, and that there aren't large numbers of Chinese who are comfortably bilingual in Malay, and the same is also true in Kelantan with Chinese and Thais who are bilingual in Malay. And so let's remind ourselves that the peninsula is ethnically, linguistically, culturally and religiously extremely diverse, which makes it a very interesting place to be studying these dynamics. And so let's also remind ourselves that the Thai-Malay Peninsula is actually the longest peninsula in the world. It's a part of the world which has been important in international commerce and trade for well over 1,000 years. And because people trading between the Middle East and China had to get around or over this large, long peninsula. People from all over the world have made contact with this peninsula, the Thai Malay Peninsula. There were times when traders went through the Straits of Malacca after 1511, when the Portuguese conquered that state. Trade shifted elsewhere, and actually significantly trade after the disruption of the Portuguese in 1511. That was what actually kicked Ayutthaya off. That's when Ayutthaya's prominence began, and so this is just one of a number of important links between the Thai and the Malay worlds. The Siamese realm of influence, sphere of influence, and Malay spheres of influence. The trade was, of course, made possible through regular monsoon winds that blew one direction 6 months of the year, and almost by clockwork went 6 months of the year the other direction. And there were important parts along the peninsula, and the narrower parts of the peninsula where there were less mountains, that trading routes operated through a combination of elephant caravans that took luggage, took trade items over the mountains, but also canoes, dugout canoes that went up estuaries and rivers, and that was those dynamics made this part of the world very, very cosmopolitan and prosperous. This part of the world has seen a number of empires based in Java and in Sumatra, and here are just some of them. There are lots of others, but to go into more details would take time that we don't have necessarily. What is true in present-day Indonesia and Malaysia was true elsewhere, that a number of kingdoms, a number of mandalas, spheres of influence, existed in what is now present-day Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and Myanmar. When we're thinking about these issues, when we think about identity and ethnicity, we often think very carefully and deliberately, unconsciously, in terms of nation states, modern day nation states, where there are ID cards where you state your ethnic background, or in some places they call it your race. But at this time, this was before the era of nation states, there were kingdoms or kerajaan, spheres of influence, where there was a symbolic, a potent, spiritual, political centre, and the number of kilometres, the size of this mandala would shrink and expand with all sorts of reasons. Military conquest, trade, prosperity, all sorts of things affected the size of the spread of these mandalas, these spheres of influence. And there were suzerain states and there were vassal states. If you were a vassal, you came under the influence of a suzerain king, someone that you paid tribute to and that you would have to send labour and soldiers to. So we need to be careful about using the accurate and appropriate terms when we think about this part of the world. We've talked about this before, the ethnic diversity of modern-day Thailand, and in the south you'll see on both of these maps, you'll see a cultural zone where there is Malay language spoken, and the ethnic groups are different from those further north. What is true for the peninsula was also true. Peninsula Thailand is also true in Peninsula Malaysia and in Peninsula Sumatra and in the island of Sumatra. And this map of Sumatra approximates the position of some of the larger and more important ethnic minorities in Sumatra: Batak, Minang, Malay, being some of the most important. And the ethnic diversity of the Straits of Malacca, both sides of the Straits of Malacca, Peninsula Malaysia and Sumatra itself, have been recently analysed by a historian called Leonard Andaya, and he's based at the University of Hawaii, and he has written this book, The Leaves of the Same Tree. Now, this book is available on the Google Drive, and I strongly recommend that you take a peek at it. It's a very, very compelling case study written by someone who is a committed circumstantialist who questions, I would say rightly, primordial ideas about ethnicity. So both sides of the Straits of Malacca are ethnically extremely diverse. Malacca used to be the centre of an international trade where people from all over the world had a presence, and that is a legacy that is so important that we need to revisit this more than once. The Leaves of the Same Tree, Leonard Andaya makes the argument that ethnic identities, we'll talk a bit later on about how difficult and problematic the idea of identity is. It's kind of folk science, it's pseudo-sociology that is used often, very frequently in the mass media, and we talk about this idea with all sorts of folks, and sometimes it's possible that we aren't sure what we mean when we use this word, but the ethnic identities along both sides of the Straits of Malacca, whether they be Batak or Minang or Malay or Orang Lao, which is like Sea Gypsies, the Orak Lawoi, they are, according to Andaya, they are plural and they are porous. Most people in pre-modern times possessed more than one ethnic identity, and the boundaries between them were often porous, and this is, of course, characteristic of circumstantialist assessments of ethnic identity. And these were imperative. There were reasons for being plurus and plural, and there were two reasons for this. The first was to establish difference, and the second was to exploit advantage. And we mentioned this in an earlier essay when we considered the work of Fredrik Barth, the Norwegian scholar associated with the circumstantialist school of ethnic studies. And so there are a range of scholars that there are scholars that place themselves on a continuum between a very strongly circumstantialist position and those committed to a primordialist perspective. It's no surprise that primordialists have got a very particular perception on nationalism. The peninsula has changed hands a number of times, and this is a map written immediately after the Anglo-Siamese Treaty of 1909, and it shows the portion of the peninsula that went from Siamese control to British control. If I was to ask, where is the boundary between the portion of South Thailand which is Malay and the portion which is Thai-speaking, or where Thai Muslims replace Malay Muslims, how would you answer that question? All maps just approximate reality, and this map is interested in the cultural geography of the South. And it is common for those not familiar with the South, either not familiar with the South in the Upper South, as we call it, or the Malay-dominated Far South, Patani, Yala and Narati Wat, and the southern parts, southern districts of Songkhla and Satun. If we're not familiar with that, we kind of think that mysteriously you go far enough north and Malay influence disappears. Those of you who don't speak Malay will not know the number of words, place names, mountain names, river names that are Malay in origin but have been Thaiized. And in addition to that, there are heroines, local heroines who played a pivotal role in repelling Burmese invaders in the late 1700s. And many people do not know that these women were actually Muslims. She was the widow of a governor of Phuket in the early Chakri dynasty, who was the wife of the governor to Phuket, sent by Kedah, the northwesternmost Malay state. She is buried in a Muslim graveyard, and this is part of her lineage. This is part of her family background. A very shrewd and brave woman she was. Okay. Perceptions of ethnicity by the Siamese were greatly influenced by the military governments in the 1930s, the 1940s, but before that, the Bangkok elites, the merchant elites, as well as the royal family, took a very dim view of ethnic minorities and saw them as, in similar ways to Europeans, savages needing to be civilized. And this is a statement of fact that these kind of records exist in European histories, and that kind of chauvinism had other forms in Thailand. And you will be aware, presumably, of the Thai customary decrees in the 1930s and the 1940s that specifically banned certain types of clothing, and those that weren't tailored, for example. The wearing of certain hats was not encouraged. And so you can see on the left-hand side the depiction of certain styles of dress which the Bangkok, the military governments in Bangkok attempted to eliminate through these cultural mandates there were a number of those cultural mandates, and this their effect has had a long legacy in Thailand. Often when I receive visitors from India, they comment at how Thai people dress in a very Western way that you would never come across in India. And they ask the reason, and I tell them, well, the reason is, this cultural mandate. Yeah. The idea of Malayness has in recent decades been criticised and examined by a number of historians and anthropologists who point out that it is a contested and insufficient way of describing a range of mainly Muslims from different ethnic backgrounds, and the ways in which Malay was used in the 1500s is very different from the way that Malay is used in the 20th century. One of the books that I've got there is written by a guy called Joel Kahn. And Joel Kahn, he pointed out, analysing some census material, that many of the populations now described as Malay by the government, or people themselves who identify as Malay, there were large numbers of mainly Muslim migrants from Sumatra that came from a range of ethnic backgrounds, but they felt it expedient to identify as Malay. The present Prime Minister of Malaysia is one of a number of Malay politicians whose ancestry may be Arab, they may be Indian. Muhammad Mahathir is from an Indian background. Badawi had Thai, I think his grandmother was Thai. And so the idea of a pristine, a racial understanding of Malayness is incredibly problematic. This is a very interesting area of anthropology and social, historical anthropology, as well as cultural geography. But in terms of modern Thainess, we understand Thainess to be linked with allegiance to Buddhism, language and allegiance to the king. And in the same way, modern Malayness, the pillars are Islam, Malay language and Adat. Now, there are a number of inter-ethnic dynamics that I have interrogated in my book, and I'll have a lecture based on one of the chapters in my book when I describe ethnic diversity. But very briefly, I wanted to mention we're going to be doing a specific lecture looking at the area of ethnonyms. But I wanted to mention that there are a number of ethnonyms. They range from autonyms, what I call myself, and exonyms, what other people call me, to describe Muslims in Thailand. And they include Kag, which in some parts of the country, some Muslim populations have absolutely no problem with. Originally literally means stranger in some contexts. In some contexts in central Thailand referred to Muslims of Indian origin. In some parts of the south, the upper south, the southern Thai-speaking south, most Muslims would refer to themselves as Kag. They would get Ahan Kag. They would eat Ahan Kag, for example, Muslim food. You can't do that in South Thai, in Patani, Yala and Ratiwat. Malays do not like being called kak because they are not guests. This is their place. We've talked about Malayness, Orang Malayu or Orge Malayu, which is shortened in the dialect to Nayu. Orang Jawi will be reading through an article by Pierre Leroux that talks about this important ethnonym. Some people some Malays refer to themselves not as Malays but just as Muslims, or Islam, and in other parts of the country people refer to themselves as Thai Muslims. So why are there so many ethnonyms, and what are the factors that affect which ones are employed? And those are going to be some of the issues that we are going to talk about in subsequent lectures. But for the time being, I think we'll just pause there. And I hope that you've enjoyed this introduction to the ethnically, religiously, and culturally diverse Thai Malay Peninsula. Thanks for watching.